Hello and welcome. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Evelyn Fuertes, and I am a community cancer control specialist at the Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey. Today, I will give you a very basic overview of clinical trials and the research process. Before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about our team. We provide education to the community and some professional education, for example, to community health workers and tobacco cessation specialists. We also work closely with researchers to help them recruit for studies like clinical trials. We work with patient navigators and have an oncology nurse navigator on our team who can answer questions you may have about cancer and treatment or help with scheduling an appointment. We also provide regional assessments so that our partner organizations and researchers are aligning their work with the actual needs within our communities. Here's what we'll be discussing today. How cancer develops, the definition of clinical trials, protecting people who are in clinical trials, the research process, who should participate, and what the future of trials will look like. Cancer takes years to develop, and we consider cancer development as the 3 phases of carcinogenesis. This is a fancy way of saying when normal cells are transformed into cancer cells. These phases include initiation, which are the first cells to mutate. Promotion is the proliferation of cancer cells. And I just want to mention that it's during this phase that we screen for cancer prevention. Here's where we are doing mammograms, pap smears, and looking for abnormal cells. Cancer prevention activities can prevent and detect cancers early. Progression is the last phase in tumor growth, and this is when the tumor becomes more invasive and aggressive and can metastasize, which means the cancer has spread to other parts of the body. Clinical trials can be done at these different time points. Some are for prevention and some are done during treatment. It's important to note that clinical trials can be done at any point in time. This is a very basic overview of the stages of cancer. When cancer is found, it's given a stage. In stage 0, abnormal cells have been found, but since they haven't spread to other tissues, they're not considered cancer. In stages 1 to 3, cancer has been diagnosed. The number represents the size of the tumor and if it has spread to nearby tissue. In stage 4, the cancer has metastasized. This means it has spread to other parts of the body, including far away parts of the body, like breast cancer spreading to a leg bone or colorectal cancer spreading to the lungs. Clinical trials are research studies in people. Many of the medicines we use today to treat cancer went through clinical trials. For example, your ibuprofen and allergy medicines had to go through clinical trials before being available to the public. And there are a few different kinds of trials. Prevention trials look for better ways to prevent a disease in people who have never had disease or to prevent the disease from returning. These kinds of trials may include medicines, vaccines, or lifestyle changes. A timely example would be the COVID vaccine trials that just took place. Screening trials test new ways for detecting diseases. For example, Rutgers developed a saliva test for COVID. That's an example of a detection method that had to go through a screening trial. Diagnostic trials study or compare tests or procedures for finding a particular disease. Screening and diagnostic are 2 different things. Screening is routine testing for patients without symptoms, and further testing may be done if a screening finds a possible abnormality. It's for patients without symptoms. Diagnostic testing is to investigate symptoms or a possible abnormality found during the screening. So this is for a patient with symptoms or for patients whose screening showed a possible abnormality. Treatment trials test new treatments. This could be a new combination of drugs or new approaches to surgery or radiation therapy. Behavioral trials look at behavioral changes meant to improve health. Quality of life trials or supportive care trials find ways to improve the comfort and quality of life of people with illnesses. Compassionate use trials are a way to provide someone who may not have any options an opportunity to try new treatment, even if it may not be fully approved. This is something that we saw with COVID treatments. Clinical trials have 5 phases. The preclinical phase is considered the development and animal testing phase of the drug. This has to be done to determine if the treatment can work in people, because in this phase, nothing is given to anyone. We have to determine if the drug is safe before being tested on humans, and this phase can take several years. Phase one trials are when researchers test a drug in a small group of people, let's say 20 to 80 people, and this is for the first time. This is to learn about dosing, which is how much medicine someone can safely take, and identify side effects. And just to be sure, side effects and safety are always monitored through all phases. Phase two trials are when the new drug is given to a larger group of people. We're looking at 100 to 300 people here. And this is to see if it's working like it's supposed to. Phase three trials are when the new drug is given to even larger groups of people. We're talking thousands of people at this point, and this is to confirm that it works. Researchers continue to monitor side effects, and this is where researchers compare it with similar treatments. Phase four trials are done after a drug is approved by the FDA. They're the branch of the government that approves drugs and made available to the public. Researchers track the drug's safety in the general public. They're looking for more information about a drug's benefits and optimal use. This phase studies the side effects caused over time in the general public. So these trials look for side effects that were not seen earlier in trials, and they also look at how well a new treatment works over a longer period of time. So let's look at the history of clinical trials. We think of clinical trials as a modern idea, but they've been around for a long time. The world's first clinical trial is recorded in the book of Daniel in the Bible. This experiment was conducted by King Nebuchadnezzar and was one of the first times that a trial was used to make public health decisions. In 1537, a French surgeon tested a treatment for battlefield wounded soldiers. James Lind is considered the first doctor to have conducted a controlled clinical trial of the modern era. In 1747, Dr. Lind was working as a ship's doctor and noticed a lot of sailors had scurvy. So scurvy is a disease that comes from a vitamin C deficiency and can kill you if it's not treated. He planned a comparative trial by giving the sailors different treatments and compared what worked and what didn't. Through trial and error, he found that by giving the sailors limes, he was able to reduce the cases of scurvy on his ship. And this was way before we knew that vitamin C could prevent scurvy. Later research was based on forms of the comparative trial. For instance, randomized trials. They use chance and pick people at random and then separate them into different groups. And the use of placebos, which compared a treatment with a sugar pill. That's the placebo. It measures psychological effects versus an actual physical effect. In cancer trials, you will never get a sugar pill or a placebo. You'll either receive the usual treatment or the new treatment that is being studied. And basically, the idea of using a comparative group became the standard for clinical trials. If you've seen or read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, then you'll know that that's a great example of unethical research. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman that lived near Baltimore. She had a very aggressive type of cervical cancer. She went to Johns Hopkins University Hospital in 1951 to get treated, and the doctors there removed the tumor, and then, without her permission, they took those cells and started to experiment on them. Basically, she didn't give consent for her cells to be used in experiments. She died shortly after her treatment, and her family wasn't compensated at the time. They did find out 20 years later and were able to get some compensation, but not without a legal battle. This is significant because her cells became very important in medical research and are still used to this day. They're called the Gila Immortal cell lines. These cell lines are the oldest and most used cell lines we have. At Hopkins, the committee tasked with deciding who can use Gila cells now includes 2 members of the Lacks family. And this isn't unique. There was also the Tuskegee study that we are hearing a lot about now with the COVID vaccine and how it still affects how African Americans deal with the medical community and vice versa. And there was Dr. J. Marion Sims, who performed gynecological experiments without anesthesia on Black slaves, even when it was available. As we move through history, and as you saw in the previous slide, there were serious problems with the way people were being treated in medical studies. In 1947, the Nuremberg Code gave us informed consent, which we'll also talk about shortly. That was as a result of the atrocities committed by Nazis during World War II. In 1974, the National Research Act was in response to the Tuskegee study, where for 40 years, African American men were deliberately not told they had syphilis and were never treated for it, even when an effective treatment was made available. Like I said in the previous slide, this has had a big effect on how African Americans deal with the medical community. And to this day, we're seeing those issues. In 1997, President Clinton made a formal apology to the survivors and their families. In 1979, the Belmont Report gave us the Institutional Review Board, which we'll also cover later in this presentation, and the importance of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice or equity in research. In 1996, the International Conference on Harmonization made these protections international. All of these regulations were put into place to protect people when they participate in clinical studies, and they continue to be updated as needed. As I mentioned, part of the regulations that were put into place was the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB is a group of people that is a combination of community members and researchers that are not a part of the study. They review the clinical trial protocol to make sure that all participants are protected and informed about what is going to happen to them if they participate in a clinical trial. If for any reason you're concerned or feel that something in the clinical trial isn't happening the way it's supposed to, the IRB is who you would go to about those concerns. And later in the presentation, we'll discuss informed consent and the protocol. In addition to the IRB, we have other government organizations that also protect individuals. These include the DSMB, or Data and Safety Monitoring Board. They make sure that clinical trials are safe for people to participate in, and they're involved in phase 3 of trials and are a part of the NIH, which is also on this list. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, oversees and regulates the conduct of clinical trials. So if you recall in the previous slide, they're the ones that mandated the IRB. They are also in charge of the Office of Good Clinical Practice. The NIH, or National Institutes of Health, provides funding for a lot of clinical trials, and they make sure that all of the trials are led by researchers that are trained in the Good Clinical Practice guidelines. Those were the guidelines we saw implemented in 1996 in the ethical Milestones slide. Because protections have been put into place, we can see where research done right can have a positive effect. Here are studies that have been conducted here at the Cancer Institute that have been inclusive and follow the protections we've just discussed. The GRACE study helps eligible breast and ovarian cancer survivors get genetic testing. The study focuses on Black, Hispanic, and women living in rural areas who are eligible for genetic testing and are not necessarily aware of it. In many cases, the hereditary forms of breast and ovarian cancers are more aggressive and can present in younger women. By surveying survivors and helping them with genetic testing, they can help members of their own family screen for cancers much earlier and before getting any symptoms, which is the goal for cancer screening, since in many cases, when you have symptoms, the cancer is more advanced and harder to treat. The Women's Circle of Health study is an inclusive breast cancer study that evaluates the causes of an early age and more aggressive breast cancer in Black women. The study is a collaborative effort between Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey, Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, the New Jersey State Cancer Registry, and Rutgers School of Public Health. Participants are recruited in 10 counties throughout New Jersey. In 2014, with additional funding from NCI, that's the National Cancer Institute, the study was enhanced and redesigned as a cohort study of Black breast cancer survivors. This follow-up study evaluates the impact of obesity and related comorbidities or other chronic disease conditions, which are seen in high amounts in this population. It also looks at quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, and survival. The third study is a targeted gene study for non-small cell lung cancer. While the first two were behavioral health studies, this study falls under precision medicine because they're targeting specific gene mutations in the tumor for eligibility. In a very simplified way of explaining, Targeted therapies can work by inhibiting or suppressing gene action that would cause or induce the tumor to grow and or spread. The consent form is required before the clinical trial. It will tell you what to expect, the purpose, risks, and benefits. It also makes sure to outline the importance of your privacy and keeping your health information confidential. It covers if there's any cost to you or payments for participation. And in many cases, most of the costs are covered by the drug makers or insurance. The informed consent is supposed to give you a crystal clear understanding of any associated costs. This is also an opportunity for the participant to ask any questions about the clinical trial. You only sign the informed consent when you have had all of your questions answered and are comfortable participating in the clinical trial. Remember, participating in a clinical trial is 100% voluntary. The consent process is ongoing, and you can withdraw or leave the trial at any time for any reason. The protocol is like a recipe. It gives you all of the information that's needed before you can start the clinical trial. It includes how long, how many people, and even reasons as to why someone might not be eligible for a clinical trial. Think of it as a recipe for the researcher. What are the steps the researchers take in a clinical trial? The process moves along step by step and starts with an idea. The following steps include experiment design. Think of the recipe we just talked about. The IRB we mentioned earlier, make sure that participants are protected. And once the protections are in place, the participants are enrolled and the study is started. It's then completed and analyzed. Finally, the results are shared. Just like the researchers have a step-by-step approach, here's what people can expect in the clinical trial process. You, with your healthcare provider, will talk about the steps in participating in a clinical trial. And let's take each step separately in the following slides. So once the diagnosis has been made, you'll work with your medical team to determine whether or not you would like to participate in or are eligible for a clinical trial. Clinical trial participation involves shared decision-making. It focuses on the participant and can improve communication between the participant and the healthcare team. It can lead to better satisfaction and reduces inequities by helping people understand information in a way that would benefit them. These decisions are made with your values in mind and by honoring your best interests. If you decide to participate in a clinical trial, you'll be informed of the risks, benefits, costs associated, if any, and the protocol. Like I mentioned before, once you fully understand the process, and only if you agree to it, you will need to sign the informed consent form. Trial participation is 100% voluntary and an ongoing process. You can withdraw or leave a clinical trial at any time for any reason. During the clinical trial, you will still be working with your medical team and, depending on the outcomes, continue the treatment. Many times, participants feel that they get better care because they are followed so closely during the clinical trial. Once the trial is completed, you and your doctor will talk about next steps, and you may consider participating in other trials. For instance, there's the follow-up for the Women's Circle of Health study I mentioned earlier. Remember, I mentioned earlier that regulations were put into place. This was to protect people in clinical studies because of past abuses. Historically, shared decision-making wasn't part of the research process, and abuses in vulnerable populations has led to mistrust, where we see the effects to this day. We're seeing it now with the COVID vaccine, and these are legitimate concerns. In addition to participant mistrust, we can also see the effects when researchers are hesitant to include trial participants because of fears of harming people, for instance, pregnant women. Because of mistrust and researcher hesitancy, certain groups of people do not participate in clinical trials. And this can affect the results of the trial because we don't really know how the missing groups will respond to treatment. And this can lead to poor treatment outcomes for these groups. And we generally see this in race, gender, and age. For instance, we know that there's a difference between races with inflammation response. One example is triple-negative breast cancer. Because of genetics, African American women have a higher risk. This doesn't include any social or economic situations. We also see this with obesity and the Asian population. The negative effects of obesity are seen at a much lower BMI. This is based only on genetics. And did you notice that both the Grace and Women's Circle of Health studies were both inclusive of race and gender that used to be excluded from studies? Another reason we need diversity is we just don't have a good representation of tissue samples. The majority of samples are from white people of European descent. Without diverse tissue samples, we have a harder time creating effective treatments for everyone. So, why should I participate in a clinical trial? What's in it for me? Participating in a clinical trial can be a hard decision, especially if you aren't sure how it can benefit you. Studies are only considered when the benefits outweigh the risks. And here are some of the pros and cons of participating in a clinical trial. Early access to new life saving or life extending treatment. The new treatment may be superior to the standard treatment. Like I mentioned before, people in clinical trials feel they get better care. For on and underinsured participants, many drug makers cover the cost of the drugs being tested. For people that are terminal, their lives may be extended long enough to get their affairs in order. And if it's a hereditary illness, you may be helping others in your own family, like in the Grace study I talked about earlier. Some studies may pay or provide participants an incentive. Have you ever received a gift card for filling out a survey? In the Grace study, participants were paid $50 per assessment, and with 4 assessments, that was $200 in their pocket. Some of the cons can include the treatment doesn't work as expected or doesn't work at all, side effects, more time needed for treatments, more doctor visits and travel. And if you have to travel far, you may need to book hotels for overnight stays. And while some behavioral health studies may provide childcare, that's generally an exception and not the rule. Clinical trials are very important to the development of new medicines and to keep us healthy. While there are some barriers, researchers today are trying very hard to include as many people as possible so that treatment options can help improve the health of our communities and future generations. And speaking of future generations, the future of clinical trials may also include studies of genes and our immune system. These studies can result in medicines and therapies that are personalized to you as an individual. And this is important, especially now that we know that there are differences among the races with inflammatory response. The non-small cell lung cancer study I spoke about earlier is an example of precision or personalized medicine. If you look at the image, the drug targets the DNA of the people that have the purple star, not the yellow chevron or the green starburst. Technology can be a useful tool to collect data and help keep people safe during clinical trials. It's a way for people to communicate easily with their healthcare providers and may make it easier to participate in a clinical trial. When you think about it, that's really the goal, making it easier to participate in a clinical trial and letting you know why it's important, helping researchers find the best ways for people to stay healthy and to create better tests and treatments that can help you now and in the future. And when you think about it, that's really the goal, making it easier to participate in a clinical trial and letting you know why it's important. We saw that there are various kinds of trials, and they all must follow the protocol set into place. Guidelines have been put into place to help keep people safe, and by participating in clinical trials, you're helping researchers find the best ways for people to stay healthy and to create better tests and treatments that can help you now and in the future. Here are some resources on and for finding clinical trials. Please take a moment to fill out this evaluation. You can use the mobile-friendly QR code if that makes it easier for you. Thank you for joining us today. If you need more information on today's webinar, any of the upcoming webinars, or screening, please feel free to send us an email at outreach@cinj.rutgers.edu.